Hello there, I'm Michele. I'm a licensed massage therapist from Washington, and I bring you MBLEx resources here on YouTube and also on my website. I have lots of free stuff for you, ebooks, study guides, practice tests, and full courses for those of you who want to take a deeper dive. I do want to apologize about the noise. I share a space with an artist next door and she's doing some work, but I promise the rest of the video is not going to have that background noise. I'm going to record it elsewhere. But what I want to do is tell you that in this video, we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, and it's going to be the 27th video in our anatomy and physiology sequence. Actually, it's more than that because I have supplemental videos, but anyway, in the anatomy and physiology sequence, we're pivoting into those less intensive systems. So respiratory system, digestive system, urinary, and reproductive systems. So we're getting close to the end, and it's only going to be one video for each of these systems from here on out. So what I'm doing is I'm just going over what you need to know to pass the massage and bodywork licensing exam. What I'm covering in this video is respiratory system components and functions, respiratory system organs, and there's the list, and then ventilation. What is that? That's where you bring in the air and let it out, how that process works. Respiration, which is the actual exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body, and how breathing is regulated. And we're going to finish up with some MBLEx practice questions. But I do want to mention that regarding the respiratory system, I'm not going to be talking about the pathologies regarding that. There is a list of pathologies. I have a video about that here on YouTube, but I also have an entire respiratory system. I have an entire pathologies course that's available on my website in the link in the description and in the pinned comment below. Also, there are PDFs for each of these videos of the slideshows for each of them if you want a copy of that for yourself, if you don't have your own anatomy and physiology textbook for massage and body workers. So make sure and get a hold of that PDF as well. And before I segue into the actual slideshow, I want to remind you to subscribe if you want to be in the loop for future videos that are coming out that will help you to pass your massage and bodywork licensing exam with calm and confidence. And also like the video so that other future massage therapists and body workers can have access to this information, because that's how the algorithm works. It works on your likes. So I appreciate you sharing the word that this information is there for those people. Without any further ado, let's get into the program. Breath, balance, and bodywork, the respiratory system. The respiratory system fuels every moment of life by delivering oxygen to the body and removing carbon dioxide, supporting energy production, pH balance, and temperature regulation. For massage therapists and body workers, understanding this system is essential. Breathing mechanics influence posture, muscle tension, lymphatic movement, emotional states, and overall client well-being. When we understand how air moves, how gas exchange occurs, and how breathing is regulated, we can better observe dysfunction, support healthier movement patterns, and choose techniques that enhance ventilation, relaxation, and healing. Okay, so the respiratory system components are split into two sections. We have the upper respiratory tract, which is everything from the throat and then going superiorly up to the nose or nasal cavity. And then we have the lower respiratory tract, which is everything from the throat inferiorly down to the lungs. So in the upper respiratory tract, we have the nose, where we inhale, and the nasal cavity, which is the pocket right behind the nose. Now, regarding the paranasal sinuses, you don't need to know the names of all the different pockets or even where they are. Just knowing that there are sinuses is enough for the massage and bodywork licensing exam. So don't worry about that. Regarding the pharynx, there are three different sections. That's the respiratory tube that goes behind the pharynx. It's the nasopharynx is right behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is right behind the mouth, and then the laryngopharynx is the most inferior part of the pharynx that attaches to the larynx. So it's just that transition. When I get over there to that slide, I'm going to
show you that there isn't much of a transition between the larynx and the laryngopharynx. Now, regarding the lower respiratory tract, we have the trachea, which is the tube that joins the larynx to the lungs. And then they have the lungs. So the lungs are the big containers for all this other stuff, the primary bronchi and the bronchioles and the alveoli, right? But something that's important, and we're going to go over that also, is 3 lobes for the right side and 2 lobes for the left. That's important for the MBLEx. And then just knowing that it goes trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, and then alveoli, or alveolar ducts to alveoli. So this is a representation, this list is a representation of going from most superior all the way down to the smallest portion of the breathing apparatus. So yeah, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi are all the branches of the trees. Bronchioles are splitting down into tinier and tinier little twigs of the tree. Terminal and respiratory. So respiratory is the closest to the alveoli, and then the alveolar ducts are the last tubes of the bronchial structures, and then alveoli are the bubbles or the grape bunches where the actual gas exchange happens inside of the lungs. So other structures that are involved in the respiratory system would be the pleura, which is the pocket that holds the lungs, and then the respiratory muscles, which help with, there's 2 different kinds of breathing. There's the forced inhalation and exhalation, and then there's just regular inhalation and exhalation that just happens out of, that's just what our body does to keep us alive. Okay, so respiratory system functions. It, of course, provides oxygen for cellular activity. So all of our cells depend on oxygen to run the right way. Now, it also produces carbon dioxide, which helps to maintain the pH. That's the acidic balance of our bodies, because the carbon dioxide, having too much carbon dioxide will change the ionic level in our bodies. And then also it eliminates heat and water through ventilation. So when we're breathing, ventilation is the name for the mechanical process of inhaling and exhaling. We lose water and heat by breathing. So when we're really hot, we're more likely to be panting a lot deeper, because our body is trying to cool us off. And then, if we have too much water, then our bodies can lose water that way. Moving on to some of the structures of the respiratory system. We're going to start with the nose and nasal cavity. That's where the air comes in first, unless we're mouth breathing. So the other name for nostrils is nares, and that's the main entry point where the air comes in. And now I want to talk about the respiratory mucosa, which lines most of the respiratory system from the nose all the way down to the bronchioles. But once we get into those bronchioles and into the alveolar ducts, there's not going to be very much of this respiratory mucosa, because the point of having it is to keep the debris out of our alveoli, so that the gas exchange can happen with as little blockage as possible. And definitely having this mucosal lining on the alveoli would keep us from being able to do that gas exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide. But real quick, just so you know what composes the respiratory mucosa: pseudostratified epithelium, which means it's their epithelial cells, which means mucus creating, but they're pseudostratified in that they're not stacked like perfectly in columns. They're kind of beep boop, beep boop, beep boop. I don't know how else to describe it. The ciliated cells are going to stick up more. Those have the cilia that are constantly moving the mucus down the line, mucus with the debris in it. The mucus creating cells are called goblet cells, because they're shaped like goblets, and so they're going to be creating the mucus. So between the cilia moving everything down the way and the mucus that's catching any kind of debris that's coming into the respiratory mucosa, nasal cavity is divided by a little barrier. It's a little kind of, there's some bone, but it's mostly cartilage. That's called the nasal septum. So divides it into 2 sections. And then the nasal conchae also known as turbinates, are little swirly things. So you see these folds right here in this cutout. This is a sagittal cutout of the skull, and we can see where the nasal septum is right here. And so this is one half. Let's say it's the left half of the skull. It's got these folds here that the air will swirl around as it's going into the respiratory system, and that slows down the air to moisten it and to warm it up and to catch any more debris out of it before it goes down further down into the respiratory system. Also known as conchae because it's shaped like a conch shell. Okay. More stuff about the nasal cavity, some functions. It filters the air with the coarse hair and mucuses, warms. I said, talked about all of that, traps the particles, and it also houses those olfactory receptors linking smell with emotion and memory. And we talked about the pockets. That's another thing. They lighten the weight of the skull, sinuses, make it so it's a little bit less heavy. And then it's also lined with mucous membranes to help catch that debris. So next we're going to the pharynx. In this image, this area right here would be the nasal cavity with the conchae, right? And then all the air is going to move down into the pharynx. And so the most superior part is going to be the nasopharynx. That's the part that's attached to the nasal cavity. And there is a tonsil in there, so that would be this structure right here. You don't have to have that memorized, the pharyngeal tonsil. Don't have to have that memorized, but what it is it's a lymphatic structure for supporting your immune system in that area. Going farther inferiorly to the back of the oral area would be the oropharynx. So it's a passageway for air, for if the sinuses and any kind of oral inhalation, but it's also a passageway for food when you're swallowing, and it also has a couple of its own tonsils for immune function, for lymphatic structures. And then finally we have the laryngopharynx. So it's all a big pocket that's connected. This yellow strip right here would be the esophagus. And what happens is when you go to swallow food, this structure right here is called the epiglottis. It will close so that the food doesn't go down the windpipe. It only goes down, get out of there. It only goes down the food pipe. So the food pipe is always open. Now you know. So yeah, common passageway, pharynx is for air, liquids, and food. And it has those tonsils for immune protection. So next we have the larynx, and I've got a bunch of images in here, and I'm going to make sense of all of them for you. So, but the key structures for the larynx would be, if you feel on the anterior part of your throat, and you're making a hum, 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 you can feel the vibration of the cartilage on the front of your throat vibrating because of those vocal folds. So here's the cartilage on the front of your throat. Thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage both male and female bodies have them, but they stick out a little bit more on male bodies than they do on female bodies. And the cricoid cartilage it's just the very, very top of the trachea. So the functions of the larynx would be an airway passage between the pharynx and the trachea. It produces sound because of the vibrating vocal cords, and it has a protective mechanism to prevent aspiration. Aspiration means inhaling your food or inhaling your liquid, inhaling your slobber, stuff like that. So that's what that structure is right there. Epiglottis closes the windpipe. The esophagus is the food tube. The larynx is right below and right around that epiglottis. And so the opening of the vocal cords is called the glottis. Here we go. I'm just going to show this. This image would be the sagittal cut of what the throat and the whole respiratory tract would look like. But this image here is a superior view, as though you're looking down someone's throat. This whole thing, this whole opening is called a glottis. Back here, this dark part would be the esophagus, where the food would go down. This part is always has a gap and is open, so that you can swallow food when you need to. But when you want to swallow food, the actual act of swallowing, part of it is the epiglottis closing. So there's a fold right here that will be open when you're breathing, but when you need to swallow a piece of food, it will flap closed so that you don't inhale your food. These side folds, these light-colored side folds, are the vocal cords. And then we have a ventricular fold, which is on the outside, around the vocal fold. That's not a big deal for you to really know a lot of details about. It's just there. And then, what else was I going to talk about? The trachea is the dark part where the air goes down. So all of this folds and closes up when you go to swallow food. Otherwise, it's open. And then we're going into the trachea. So I have a little video here of the different kinds of cartilage. So we've got the top part, that would be the thyroid cartilage, and then we've got the cricoid cartilage. And everything below that, you see all these little rings here, that would be the trachea. The reason that we have these cartilaginous rings is to keep that trachea open always. But there is a little gap in the posterior part of that tube, which is for the esophagus to allow food down. So sometimes if you're swallowing a bite that's too big, if you can feel it kind of cut off your air a little bit, that's because that food is sliding down the back of the trachea. But it'll always open back up because we have those cartilaginous rings going around the trachea, so we can always breathe. Yeah, so they keep it open. Esophagus needs to be able to expand. The functions of the trachea is it brings air between the larynx and the bronchi, which is the breathing tree. And then it's lined with mucociliary, can I say this? Mucociliary escalator. Those are the cilia that trap debris and move it up into the throat for coughing out. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the lungs. So the lungs are surrounded by pleura, which I don't have in this image, in this video. But as you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3 lobes on the left side, and we only have 1, 2 lobes on the right side. And that's because the heart sits right there in that little gap. So that's the most important thing, just knowing about the pleura, which is the pocket that holds the lungs. It has the visceral, this is where I put the pleura over the top of the lungs. So the visceral layer of the pleura is going to be attaching to the actual lungs, and the parietal layer is going to be out on the outside, lining the inside of the rib cage. And what those do, and there's liquid inside of it that the mucous membranes create on the inside of those two layers, and it protects the lungs from the friction of breathing. It keeps them safe. The bronchial tree, trachea here, and then it splits off into the 2 primary bronchi. Right, the right side is larger and it's going to be more vertical just because of the different shapes, thanks to the heart being in there. This looks like it's pretty much a mirror image, but that's not the way the tree looks in real life, just to let you know. So the secondary bronchi are also known as lobar bronchi. So they are the secondary branches coming off of the tree. And then tertiary are going to be the other little branches coming off. And then from there, they turn into bronchioles. Those would be the twiggy parts of the tree. So there's the terminal bronchioles, which are closer. Terminal bronchioles are going to be the ones that are closer to the bronchi, closer to the center. And then the respiratory ones are going to be closer to the alveoli. They have smooth muscle tissue, there's no cartilage to keep them open. So they distribute the air to the lungs, and they filter debris as the passages narrow. They get narrower and narrower. So a little bit more about alveoli and the respiratory membrane. So the alveoli look like little grapes, little grape bundles, and their walls are 1 cell thick, and that is so that the gas exchange can happen really easily between the cells of the lungs and the bloodstream. So they are lined with epithelial cells, which means that they produce some kind of fluid, and in this case it's called a fluid called a surfactant that helps to keep the alveoli from sticking together and keeps it open. They also have macrophages that are embedded inside of them, which are, as we learned in our previous videos on the immune system and also on the bloodstream, macrophages are cell eaters. So they eat bacteria or any kind of germs that are trying to get into this space. The respiratory membrane is the space in between the blood cells and the alveoli. So it's the site where the gas exchange happens. When it's in the alveoli, oxygen is always going into the bloodstream, and out of the bloodstream into the alveoli comes the carbon dioxide. Mechanical breathing, otherwise known as ventilation, is the act of bringing air, fresh air, into the alveoli and releasing them out so that the gas exchange can occur. Inhalation happens not because we're like, I'm sucking the air in. The way that it actually happens is that the nervous system tells your diaphragm that it's time to get more oxygen in your body, and so it triggers the diaphragm to contract, which draws the diaphragm inferiorly into the abdominal cavity. And when it does that, it changes the pressure. Also, the external intercostals will lift the ribs up. So it creates an expanded space inside of the chest cavity, inside of the thoracic area. And so that changes the air pressure in this space so that there is less air pressure in here than there is on the outside of your body. When that happens, it will cause that air, these blue arrows, to come down through your sinuses or your mouth. And so that happens involuntarily. We can voluntarily inhale extra big and engage more muscles and open that chest cavity up even more, but that you can't inhale without engaging your muscles and opening your chest cavity. So that should always be your goal when you're trying to get more air in your body, is to open your chest cavity as much as you can. And then exhalation is typically passive. It's really just a matter of the inhalation muscles relaxing. So the diaphragm relaxes, the rib cage falls, thoracic volume is going to decrease, which pushes the air out. So it turns into the volume of the thoracic cage gets smaller, which increases the pressure inside the lungs, and it pushes the air out. That's how it happens. Forced exhalation is when you engage more muscles. Typically it's during coughing or when you're exercising. So the muscles of forced exhalation are going to be your internal intercostals and your abdominal muscles. Now, regarding respiration, which is where the actual gas exchange happens, we need to know the difference between external and internal respiration. External respiration is when the air or the carbon dioxide is going out of the lungs. So that'll help you to remember. External means it's going out of the lungs. It's going out of your body. Carbon dioxide is leaving your body. So external respiration is just what happens at the alveoli. Internal respiration is what happens in the tissues in the system when the oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide. So diffusion is the way that it always happens because the oxygen molecules are so small, the carbon dioxide molecules are so small. So it just happens across the cell membrane. There's no other process that has to be involved. Just has to have the right pressure in order for those molecules to bleed over. Internal respiration occurs in the body tissues. Oxygen is released from the hemoglobin and goes into the tissues. Carbon dioxide comes from the tissues and goes into the blood. So when the carbon dioxide, first of all, oxygen, O2 is O2, and it just gets on that hemoglobin and gets to where it needs to go. However, carbon dioxide doesn't always need to be attached to hemoglobin to get back to the alveoli and out of the body. So the three ways that carbon dioxide can be transferred in the blood from the tissues and then out to the alveoli, it doesn't have to attach to the hemoglobin. About 20% of it will attach to the hemoglobin as what they call carbaminohemoglobin. But the rest of it is converted into bicarbonate, which is HCO3, which dissolves into the plasma of the blood and can be taken out of the body that way. Now, how is regulation of breathing controlled? We have, for the involuntary breathing, we have the medulla oblongata, which is the main rhythm generator of our breathing. And then we have the pons, which fine-tunes the rate and the smoothness. So those are the two nervous system. These are the two nervous system command centers. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. That's an important one. I do believe I got a question like that on the MBLEx about this. So the phrenic nerve does innervate the diaphragm. And is that a cranial nerve? Let me know in the comments. So voluntary control from the cerebral cortex, which is in here, in the actual brain part, can override the involuntary nature of breathing so that you can talk or sing or do breath practices. Normal breathing rate is 12 to 18 breaths per minute. That's an important thing for the MBLEx. Other ways that the breathing is controlled: chemoreceptors that are in our arteries can detect an increase in carbon dioxide, a decrease in oxygen, and a decrease in pH. So when those aortic bodies, their receptors figure out that there's not enough oxygen and there's too much carbon dioxide, it will trigger an increase in breathing. Also, we have stretch receptors in the bronchioles that will keep us from overinflating our lungs. And we have proprioceptors in our joints and muscles that will help us to increase our breathing when we're moving around a lot so we can get more oxygen. And then regarding control and regulation of breathing, we do have some emotion centers for when we're not feeling very well emotionally, for fear, stress, or grief, that those will all alter our breathing patterns. Okay, time for some questions, because we got through all the information, all the new information that we need to know regarding the respiratory system in order to pass the Massage and Bodywork licensing exam. So let's start with the first question. Which structure provides the greatest initial defense against inhaled pathogens and debris? So we need a structure that has the greatest initial defense. Like, what first is going to protect against inhaled pathogens and debris? Our options are A, cilia lining the trachea. The trachea is a little bit farther down the line compared to like the nasal area. So nasal conchae and nasal hairs, I think those are pretty high up on the list of defenses against inhaled pathogens and debris. We have the alveolar macrophages. The macrophages are not the first line of defense, they're the last line of defense. And then the epiglottis is the flap that keeps you from being able to inhale your food. So regarding this question, I would go for B, because it's the structure that is closest to where the air comes in the first place for defending against inhaled pathogens and debris. So yay! Explanation is the nasal cavity warms, humidifies, and filters incoming air through the combined action of nasal hairs and the turbulence created by the conchae. This catches most large particles before they reach the lower respiratory tract, Although cilia and macrophages are important, they act later in the airway. The epiglottis prevents aspiration during swallowing, not inhalation. Next question. During a quiet inhalation, which physiological change allows air to enter the lungs? What do they mean by quiet inhalation? Maybe we'll get a clue when we read our options. A. Increased intrathoracic pressure. Increased pressure inside of the thoracic cage does what? It makes us exhale. So A can't be right when it comes to allowing air to enter the lungs. B, decreased volume of the thoracic cavity, which means there's a smaller volume in the cavity, which means that there's going to be more intrathoracic pressure. So B would not be right either. C, diaphragm contraction creating negative pressure. Negative pressure meaning less pressure when the diaphragm contracts. So less pressure meaning that the cavity is opening because the diaphragm is contracting. So that does allow air into the lungs. And then D, relaxation of the external intercostals. That can't be right because the external intercostals help to open up the thoracic cavity. So C, diaphragm contraction creating negative pressure. Explanation. When the diaphragm contracts and flattens, the thoracic cavity volume increases, causing intrathoracic pressure to drop below atmospheric pressure. Air naturally moves from higher to lower pressure, pulling air into the lungs. This is an active process requiring muscular effort. External intercostals contract, not relax, during inhalation. Next question. Which statement best explains why the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung only has 2? A. The left lung receives less blood flow and therefore needs fewer lobes. I don't think that's true. B. The right lung requires more surface area for gas exchange. C. The left lung must accommodate the position of the heart. This is the only option that's mentioned, the heart. And then D. The right lung contains larger bronchioles. I don't think that's true. I think that the best answer is C because I've never heard of that. And requiring more surface area, I don't think that's true. So C would be the correct answer. The left lung must accommodate the position of the heart. The explanation is the left lung has a cardiac notch where the heart sits, reducing available space and limiting it to 2 lobes. The right lung has no structural obstruction, allowing 3 lobes. Gas exchange needs are similar for both lungs and do not determine the lobe number. Bronchial size is not the reason for asymmetry. Which change would most likely stimulate an increase in ventilation rate? So what is going to most strongly stimulate an increase? Most strongly stimulate. That could mean that there are a few options here that will stimulate an increase, but which is going to be the most strong? A mild drop in oxygen saturation. A mild drop in oxygen means that our body would want more oxygen, but it's not doesn't sound like a very strong option. B, a rise in carbon dioxide and a decrease in pH. So raising the carbon dioxide maybe won't increase ventilation rate. C, stretch receptors are inhibiting inhalation. That would not stimulate an increase or increase temperature in the blood. Let's see, most strongly. So I'm going to look at this again. A, increase that makes you want to breathe more. So a drop in oxygen saturation would definitely make you want to breathe more, but it says a mild drop. A rise in carbon dioxide and a decrease in pH. I like that one because when you have a lot of carbon dioxide, your body's going to want to try to get more oxygen in because it's going to want to change that pH to be closer to what we need it to be. So B, a rise in carbon dioxide and decrease in pH is the best answer. And I'm going to read this explanation. Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic arteries respond most strongly to elevated carbon dioxide or acidic pH, triggering deeper and faster breathing. This response helps remove excess carbon dioxide and restore acid-base balance. Oxygen changes influence breathing only when levels drop severely. Stretch receptors are primarily present Stretch receptors primarily prevent overinflation, not regulate minute-to-minute ventilation. Okay, so that's it for us today. And with that, I'm going to leave off and make sure and get your subscribe on and make sure and like the video so that other people that are massage therapy body worker students can have access to this information. And I will see you in the next video. It's going to be all about the digestive system. Toodaloo.